My name is Jonas Weber, and I'm 39 years old. It all started because I didn't learn this from a study. I learned it from my German father, who did something strange every night before bed. No prayers, no meditation, no affirmations. Just two simple rules that he quietly repeated to himself every night while sitting at the edge of my bed. At the time, I didn't understand what he was doing. It didn't feel important. It didn't feel like parenting advice. It was just something that happened, the same way brushing your teeth or turning off the lights happens. Years later, psychologists began noticing something unusual about children raised this way. They weren't fearless. They weren't unusually confident. But they almost never developed chronic anxiety as adults. When I finally asked why these two rules worked so well before sleep, the answer wasn't what I expected. It had nothing to do with discipline, reassurance, or positive thinking. And once you hear what those rules were, you'll understand why most parents, without realizing it, end up teaching their children the exact opposite. Before I tell you about the rules themselves, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories about quiet changes that shape a lifetime. And if you're comfortable sharing, write in the comments whether nights were calm or difficult for you as a child. Now let me take you back to what bedtime actually felt like in our house. The room was always quiet by the time my father came in. Not silent in a dramatic way, just settled, like the house had finally agreed to stop performing for the day. The hallway light stayed on, soft and yellow, spilling across the floor and stopping just short of my bed. Outside, the street was still awake. Cars passed occasionally. Somewhere in the building, a radiator clicked and hissed as it cooled. Nothing about the moment felt special, which is probably why it stayed with me. I was the kind of child who thought too much at night. My mind would start racing the second the lights went out, like it had been waiting all day for the chance. Small worries turned into large ones. Questions that didn't matter in sunlight suddenly felt urgent. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to follow my own thoughts until they tangled into something uncomfortable. I didn't have the language for it back then, but looking back, I recognized the early shape of anxiety taking form, quiet and patient, the way something grows when nobody is watching. My father never rushed bedtime. He never stood in the doorway or checked his watch. He would sit on the edge of the bed, not too close, not too far, and rest his hands on his knees as if he was grounding himself before he said anything. Sometimes he looked at me. Sometimes he didn't. What I remember most is that he never tried to fix what I was feeling. If I said I was scared, he didn't tell me there was nothing to be afraid of. If I said I couldn't stop thinking, he didn't tell me to calm down. He didn't argue with my mind the way adults often do, like fear is a child being dramatic and the solution is to correct it. Instead, he would sit there quietly for a moment, as if he were preparing himself rather than me. At the time, I didn't understand that pause. It almost bothered me. I was used to adults filling space. At school, at family gatherings, even on the street, adults seemed to believe that silence meant something had gone wrong. But in that room, my father treated silence like a normal part of being alive. He didn't make it heavy. He didn't make it meaningful. He just let it exist long enough for my body to notice that nothing bad happened when nobody spoke. Some nights I asked questions, not about monsters or the dark, but about things that didn't have clear answers. What happens if something goes wrong tomorrow? Why people get sick? Why adults look worried even when they pretend not to be? My father didn't answer all of them. That was another strange thing. He wasn't uncomfortable with leaving things unfinished. He didn't rush to close every loop before sleep like it was his job to make the world clean and complete by morning. If my question didn't have a real answer, he didn't manufacture one just to soothe me. He stayed with the question the way you stay with whether you can't change. Other nights, I said nothing at all. I just watched him sit there, steady and unbothered, as if the world outside the room could do whatever it wanted and it wouldn't follow us in. Those were the nights that felt the safest, though I wouldn't have known how to explain why. Nothing had been solved. Nothing had been promised. And yet my body would start to relax on its own, as if it had been given permission to let go. I noticed early on that my friends' houses felt different at night. Sleepovers were louder, more chaotic. Parents would rush through good nights, half listening while giving instructions or reminders. Some tried to reassure us, telling us everything would be fine. Tomorrow would be better. There was nothing to worry about, like fear was a mistake that needed correcting before the lights went out. Others were distracted, already thinking about the next day. I remember lying awake in unfamiliar rooms, feeling a tightness in my chest I didn't usually feel at home, and not understanding why. The silence there wasn't settled. It felt abandoned, like the adults had left the room but taken the safety with them. At the time, I assumed that was normal, that everyone felt that way sometimes. What I didn't realize was that bedtime wasn't just the end of the day. It was a kind of handoff. A moment when a child's nervous system learns what to do with everything that didn't get resolved before the lights went out. Most nights, my father treated that moment with a level of care that felt almost excessive, though he never made a show of it. He didn't turn it into a lesson. He didn't turn it into a speech. He just showed up the same way, in the same place, with the same calm, like he was building something through repetition. Years later, people would ask me what my childhood was like, and I'd say it was normal because I didn't know any other word for it. I didn't understand that the most important part of that room wasn't the hallway light or the radiator or the way my father sat with his hands on his knees. It was the fact that he didn't fight my fear for me. He didn't teach me that fear was an emergency. He didn't teach me that it needed to be chased out before I could sleep. He taught me something without ever announcing he was teaching it. What happened next didn't feel important at the time, but it shaped everything that came after. What I didn't know then was that my father followed the same pattern every night, whether I spoke or not. It wasn't a routine you'd notice unless you were looking for it. There were no gestures meant to calm me, no tricks to redirect my thoughts. He didn't smooth the air with his voice or reach for reassurance the way most parents do when a child looks unsettled. Instead, he stayed consistent in a way that felt almost invisible. The same share of space between us, the same unhurried presence, the same willingness to sit with whatever mood had arrived in the room without trying to replace it. At the time, it felt unremarkable. That was the point. Children don't remember what feels normal, they absorb it. Night after night, my body learned that nothing dramatic happened when fear showed up. It wasn't punished. It wasn't rewarded. It wasn't negotiated with. It was simply allowed to exist in the room, like the radiator noise or the passing cars outside. Present, but not in control. My father never announced what he was doing. He didn't say, "This is how you deal with worry," or "This is how you calm your mind." He didn't explain anything at all. He behaved as if the situation already made sense, as if there was nothing that needed to be fixed urgently. That confidence did something subtle. It told my nervous system that fear was not evidence of danger. It was just another state the body moved through. Some nights, when I told him I was scared, he didn't ask follow-up questions. He didn't dig for causes. He didn't try to make the feeling smaller by naming it or making it logical. He acknowledged it the same way you acknowledge a fact you can't change. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he said, very quietly, "I know." And then he stopped there. No reassurance attached. No attempt to replace the feeling with something brighter or safer. That restraint confused me as a child. I had friends whose parents would talk them through every fear, mapping out solutions, inventing certainty where none existed. I watched adults try to overpower anxiety with logic and optimism, like volume alone could force it to retreat. My father never did that. He didn't give fear something to push against. He didn't turn it into a problem that needed managing before sleep could happen. Instead, he treated it like something temporary. I didn't realize how unusual this was until much later. Most parents, I would learn, feel responsible for removing discomfort before bedtime. They want the night to start clean, with no loose ends, no emotional residue. They rush to reassure, distract, explain, promise. And in doing so, they teach the brain something quietly but persistently. This feeling is dangerous, and you cannot handle it on your own. My father taught the opposite without ever saying it. By not interfering, he showed my body that it could survive a feeling without instruction. That nothing catastrophic happened when fear wasn't corrected immediately. That sleep didn't require certainty. It required safety, and safety came from consistency, not answers. There was another part of the ritual that mattered just as much. He never carried the day into the night with me. He didn't ask how school went once I was in bed. He didn't remind me of things I needed to do tomorrow. He didn't revisit mistakes or prepare me for what was coming next. Once bedtime arrived, the day was treated as closed, whether it felt resolved or not. That boundary was never explained, but it was enforced gently every night. I remember once trying to talk about something that had gone wrong earlier that day, expecting him to help me think through it before I slept. He listened, nodded, and then said something that surprised me. He said it belonged to tomorrow. Not in a dismissive way, not impatient, just factual, like pointing out the weather. And with that, the conversation ended. As a child, that felt unsatisfying. I wanted closure. I wanted reassurance that things would be okay. But my body learned something more important than reassurance in that moment. It learned that sleep was not a workspace, that my mind did not need to stay alert to be responsible, that there was a time when thinking could stop without consequences. Night after night, the same pattern repeated. Presence without interference. Acknowledgement without amplification. A clear, quiet boundary between the day and the night. No lectures. No techniques. Just repetition, steady enough to become invisible. I didn't notice the effect while it was happening. You rarely notice the shape of something you're inside of. But years later, when I watched other people struggle to fall asleep, rehearsing conversations, replaying mistakes, planning tomorrow in the dark, I began to sense that something had been installed in me early on. Not confidence, not fearlessness, something quieter and more durable. Years later, this would matter more than anyone realized. The first time I noticed the difference was long after childhood, when fear was no longer theoretical. I was in my early 20s, living in a small apartment with 2 roommates, both of us carrying the same quiet pressure that seems to follow people into adulthood. Exams, deadlines, expectations, relationships that felt uncertain. The usual things. On the surface, we were similar. None of us lacked ambition. None of us were sheltered from stress. But at night, our reactions to it couldn't have been more different. My roommates stayed awake long after the lights were off. Conversations stretched past midnight, circling the same worries from different angles. Someone would say they were anxious, and the others would rush to reassure them. It never lasted. The reassurance faded almost immediately, and the anxiety returned louder, sharper, demanding another round of attention. Laptops stayed open on beds. Phones glowed in the dark. Sleep felt like something that had to be earned through exhaustion. I watched this pattern repeat night after night, confused by how familiar it seemed to them and how foreign it felt to me. I wasn't calmer because I had fewer worries. I had the same ones, sometimes more. The difference was that when I lay down, something in me expected rest, not as a reward, but as a given. If a thought appeared, it was allowed to pass through. It didn't demand action. It didn't feel like an emergency. That was when I realized something important. I wasn't fearless. I still felt anxiety. I still worried about the future. But fear didn't trap me in the same way. It arrived, lingered, and then moved on. It didn't harden into a constant background noise. I didn't need distraction to survive it, and I didn't need certainty to fall asleep. At first, I assumed this was temperament, that some people were simply wired this way. But the longer I paid attention, the less that explanation held up. People around me weren't weak or overly sensitive. They were capable, intelligent, driven. What they lacked wasn't strength. It was rest. Their nervous systems never fully stood down. Even in silence, they stayed alert, scanning for what might go wrong next. I started noticing it everywhere. Friends who couldn't sleep without music or television. Colleagues who checked their phones the moment a conversation slowed. People who felt uneasy in quiet rooms, as if stillness itself were a threat. They weren't avoiding boredom. They were avoiding themselves. And most of them didn't know why. That curiosity turned inward. I began asking myself why my experience had been different. Why I didn't feel the same urgency to manage every thought before sleep. Why silence didn't feel hostile. The answer didn't come all at once. It surfaced slowly, through contrast, through watching how others handled fear when no one was watching. That was when the pattern started to appear. Once I noticed the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. It wasn't limited to my apartment or my friends. It showed up in lecture halls, in offices, in cafes late at night, when people lingered longer than they needed to. The same restlessness, the same inability to fully disengage. Different lives, different pressures, but a shared relationship with fear that felt strangely familiar. I started paying attention to where people came from, not geographically at first, but emotionally. What their nights had been like as children. How bedtime had been handled in their homes. The answers were rarely dramatic. No trauma. No obvious neglect. Just habits. Routines. Small, repeated moments that had never seemed important enough to remember. Some people described bedtime as rushed. A checklist before the lights went out. Teeth brushed. Pajamas on. A quick, good night, delivered halfway down the hallway. Others remembered long conversations meant to calm them down, Parents explaining why there was nothing to fear, why everything would be okay, why tomorrow would be better. The intention was always care. The result, often, was the same: a nervous system that learned it needed help to settle. The contrast became clearer when I started meeting people from different parts of Germany through work. Not everyone, not universally, but often enough to notice. There was a quiet similarity in the way some of them spoke about sleep, about stress, about uncertainty. They didn't describe themselves as calm or confident. They described themselves as steady, as if fear was something they experienced, not something they had to defeat. In conversations that drifted late into the evening, I heard echoes of my own childhood without anyone naming it directly. Parents who treated bedtime as a boundary, not a negotiation. Homes where the day was allowed to end without being fully resolved. Where children weren't taught to chase reassurance before sleep, but weren't abandoned to their fears either. It wasn't a parenting style you could identify at a glance. There were no slogans, no methods passed around in books or blogs. Just a quiet consistency in how nights were handled. A sense that sleep was not a continuation of the day, but a different state altogether, one that deserved protection. Only later did researchers begin to notice the same thing. They weren't studying obedience or emotional intelligence. They weren't measuring happiness or success. They were tracing patterns of anxiety back through decades, looking for something that could explain why some nervous systems settled more easily than others. What they found wasn't behavior. It was regulation. And it started at night. When the science finally entered the conversation, it didn't arrive with certainty or fanfare. It arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, as if even the researchers were surprised by how small the cause seemed compared to the size of the effect. They weren't studying bedtime routines at first. They were studying anxiety. Chronic, low-grade anxiety that followed people into adulthood without any obvious trigger. The kind that doesn't announce itself as panic, but as constant vigilance. Difficulty resting. Difficulty letting thoughts go. A feeling of always being slightly on. What kept appearing in the data wasn't trauma or upbringing in the dramatic sense. It was timing. Specifically, what happened to the nervous system right before sleep. Neuroscientists have a simple way of explaining it. As the body prepares for sleep, the brain shifts into a state where it stops evaluating and starts encoding. During the day, we interpret experiences. At night, we store them. Whatever the nervous system experiences in the final moments before sleep is treated less like information and more like instruction. Safety or threat. Permission or pressure. Completion or unfinished responsibility. This is why bedtime matters more than people think. Not emotionally, but biologically. The brain is deciding what the baseline of reality feels like when nothing is actively happening. And it uses that baseline to shape how we respond to stress later on. When fear is dismissed at night, the nervous system doesn't learn that fear is harmless. It learns that fear must be avoided. When reassurance is rushed, the brain doesn't learn safety. It learns dependency. And when problems are carried into sleep, the body learns that rest is conditional. The studies didn't frame this as a mistake. They framed it as an accident. Parents weren't causing anxiety. They were unintentionally training the nervous system to stay alert when it should be powering down. What stood out most to researchers was what didn't work. Positive affirmations, distraction, logical explanations. All of them activated the thinking brain at the exact moment it needed to quiet. All of them delayed regulation instead of allowing it. The children who showed lower anxiety years later weren't the ones who were reassured the most. They were the ones whose bodies learned two things before sleep: that feelings can exist without escalation, and that responsibility does not follow you into rest. No lectures, no instructions, no emotional performance, just repetition. And this is where most parents, without knowing it, do the opposite. Not because they don't care, but because modern life makes stillness feel unsafe. Bedtime becomes the last chance to fix the day, to prepare for tomorrow, to prevent fear instead of allowing it to pass through. In trying to help, adults bring daytime urgency into a moment that biologically cannot tolerate it. The science didn't condemn this. It explained it. And once you understand that, it becomes impossible to unsee how quietly anxiety is taught, one well-meaning bedtime at a time. Once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Not as bad parenting, not as neglect, but as urgency leaking into a moment that was never meant to hold it. Most parents don't make obvious mistakes at bedtime. They make reasonable ones. They rush because the day has been long. They explain because the child is upset. They reassure because fear feels like something that should be removed as quickly as possible. You're fine. Nothing is going to happen. Don't think about it. Go to sleep. You'll feel better in the morning. All of it sounds loving. All of it is meant to help. But the nervous system doesn't hear intention. It hears pattern. When fear shows up at night and is immediately corrected, the body learns that fear is dangerous and unacceptable. When a child is told to stop thinking, the brain learns that thoughts are something to fight. When reassurance is repeated night after night, the nervous system quietly concludes, I can't calm myself without someone else. None of this causes anxiety right away. That's why it's so hard to notice. The child still sleeps. The child still grows. Everything looks fine. The effect shows up years later, when the body no longer remembers how to settle without intervention, when silence feels uncomfortable, when rest feels undeserved, when the mind keeps scanning even in safe places. Researchers describe this as a form of learned alertness, not hypervigilance born from danger, but vigilance trained through habit. The body was never taught how to end the day, so it doesn't. This is why so many adults feel exhausted without knowing why. Why they struggle to fall asleep even when nothing is wrong. Why their minds keep rehearsing problems long after action is no longer possible. It isn't because they worry too much. It's because worry was never given a boundary. Parents don't mean to do this. In fact, most are doing exactly what they were taught. Fix the feeling. Close the loop. Make sure everything is okay before the lights go out. But biologically, bedtime isn't about closure. It's about transition. And when that transition is filled with explanations, plans, reminders, and emotional intensity, the nervous system doesn't downshift. It stays online. The damage isn't dramatic. It's cumulative. It shows up as restlessness instead of rest, as thinking instead of sleeping, as a low-grade tension that never fully releases. And by adulthood, it feels normal. That's the quiet tragedy of it. Anxiety doesn't arrive as a crisis. It arrives as a background condition, something people adapt to, compensate for, and eventually identify with. This is why the German family stood out, not because they did something special, but because they stopped doing something unnecessary. They didn't try to resolve fear at night. They didn't demand calm. They didn't turn bedtime into a performance of reassurance. They treated sleep like a border. And borders, when respected, teach the nervous system where it can finally let go. That's what most parents accidentally cross. And that's why the two rules mattered so much more than they seemed. My father waited a long time before he ever stated the rules clearly. Not because they were complicated, but because once you name them, you can't unsee how rarely they're followed. He told me them one evening in his kitchen, years after I'd stopped sleeping in that small room with the yellow hallway light. We were standing quietly, no television on, no sense of urgency in the air. It felt deliberate, the way he chose the moment, as if he understood that rules about sleep should only be spoken when the body is already calm. The first rule, he said, is that no feeling is a problem at night. He let that sit for a moment. Fear doesn't need correcting. Worry doesn't need arguing. Sadness doesn't need explaining. At bedtime, feelings are allowed to exist without being managed. Not because they're unimportant, but because the body learns safety by surviving them without interference. The rule was never about comfort. It was about trust. Trust that a child can feel something and still be safe. Then he told me the second rule. The night doesn't belong to the day. Nothing unresolved is carried forward. Nothing unfinished is rehearsed. Nothing tomorrow needs attention yet. Sleep is not preparation. It's release. Those were the rules. Allow the feeling. Release the responsibility. He didn't present them as wisdom. He didn't say they would prevent anxiety or shape a life. He spoke about them the way you speak about something practical, almost obvious, like closing a door before winter or turning off a light when you leave a room. What struck me most was how little force they required. No affirmations. No rituals. No explanations. Just restraint. In a world that constantly asks the nervous system to stay online, these rules did the opposite. They taught the body how to end something without finishing it, how to rest without permission, how to trust that nothing would be lost by letting go. I understood then why my father had never sounded proud when he spoke about those nights. He hadn't been trying to give me an advantage. He'd been trying to spare me a burden. Because once you learn to carry everything to bed, unlearning it takes years. And once you learn how to put things down, you don't forget. I still don't follow the rules perfectly. Life is louder now, more insistent. There are nights when thoughts follow me despite my best intentions. But when that familiar tension starts to build, I notice it sooner. I don't rush to fix it. I don't argue with it. I let it be there. And then I stop feeding it. Most nights, that's enough. Not to erase worry, but to remind my body that rest is still allowed. Sometimes I think back to that small room, the edge of the bed, the way my father would stand up without saying much at all. No reassurance. No promises. Just the quiet certainty that nothing more was required of me. That's what stayed. Not the rules themselves, but the feeling they left behind. A sense that the day could end without everything being resolved. That the mind didn't have to earn its rest. That peace wasn't something you create at night. It was something you stop interrupting. And once you felt that kind of safety settle into place, it doesn't disappear. It waits. Even when the world gets louder. Even when life pulls harder. Quiet. Available. Unimpressed by urgency. Just there, when you finally let the day go. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more quiet stories that stay with you. And if you'd like, share in the comments what bedtime felt like for you growing up.